Charles Dickens. The bicentenary of the birth of Charles Dickens in 2012 was celebrated in myriad ways across the English-speaking world and beyond. Dickens is renowned for his colorful and inventive writing, much of which was influenced by his personal views and experiences of Victorian life. He was one of the forebringers of the Victorian novel. His novels are notable for their wide cast of vivid and endearing characters, as well as their perceptive reflection on contemporary social and economic challenges. He cared deeply about the suffering of the working class and the poor, and many of his novels aim to expose the inequalities and disparities of Victorian society. Dickens was famous for his own storytelling technique, in addition to his social commentary. He was a master of plot, and many of his works had elaborate, multi-layered plots that kept readers interested from beginning to end. He was also a prolific writer, who throughout the course of his career created a large number of novels, short tales, and other works. His impact on the evolution of the English novel is still evident today. Charles Dickens' earlier novels were full of social criticism interlaced with humor, novels like Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield. But his later novels are darker, indicting Victorian society and humanity in general. 1852, he wrote Bleak House, whose aim seemed to be to tell us that good is not victorious. In 1854, he wrote Hard Times, which attacked industrialism and its ills. In 1860, he wrote Great Expectations, which satirizes Dickens' own desperate lower middle class passion to rise to a gentleman's status. And then in 1864, he wrote Our Mutual Friend, which satirizes Victorian materialism and the flaunting of wealth. So by now, I assume that you're aware about what kind of topics the Victorian novel usually dealt with. And because of this reason, it was also known as the industrial novel, which was established as a genre by three predecessors: Francis Trollope, Elizabeth Gaskell, and Charlotte Bronte. When we speak of the industrial novel, the usual suspects include Benjamin Disraeli's Sybil, Elizabeth Gaskell's Kingsley Alton Locke, Charlotte Bronte's Shirley, Dickens' Hard Times, and Gaskell's North and South. But not all of these novels posited factories or industrial labor practices as recurring reform. Stone's and Craig's novels, for instance, are sympathetic, even defensive portraits of mill owners. In and through the Victorian era, industrialization made rapid progress that resulted in the polarization of society into two camps, that is, the rich and the poor, or the exploiter and the exploited. Although these two camps lived side by side, there was no communication between them, which inevitably brought class struggles along with it. The poor workers and their families almost had no social securities. Because of the economic recession and fluctuation or progress in mechanization, workers were laid off. These conditions became the storyline of industrial novels, especially during the Victorian era, when novel reading was a popular activity, particularly among the middle class. This subgenre of the Victorian novel is also known as the social problem novel, or the condition of England novel, which deals with problems of class prejudice, industrialization, race, and gender. Authors of these industrial novels narrated the plight of workers and their harsh working conditions, as well as their living conditions. It was an attempt to entice the middle class to sympathize with the workers' plight. As industrialization grew, the gap between the poor working class and the rich middle class widened, while communication between the two classes shrank. A certain level of sympathy for the oppressed and voiceless working class is expressed in these novels, while better communication between masters and workers to solve these problems seems to put forward as a solution, rather than allowing the situation to get more polarized through riots, strikes, or lockouts due to the social, political, and economic problems that stem from industrialization and urbanization. Industrialization brings class distinction to a higher level because of the growing economic gap between the manufacturer and the worker. These Victorian novelists are putting across their ideas about the relationship between middle class and the working class. However, the unions, strikes, riots, or any other organizations pertaining to workers are not considered to be peaceful and viable solutions to the industrial problems affecting the poor. oppressed, and suppressed, and suffering working class. Because of the attitudes of the union leaders, the unions are portrayed misleading. The fear of violence, as reflected in these novels, and as witnessed in the history of England, like the Luddite riots of 1811 to 1815, Preston lockouts of 1853 to 1854, and the Chartist movement of 1839 to 1850s. It puts the novelists into indecisive and conflicting feelings towards rioting workers as reflected through characters such as Moses, Barraclough, and Slackbridge, Higgins, and others. It seems that the workers and manufacturers need to find a consensus for the welfare of society at large. The industrial novel, therefore, would not only perceive and represent the negative aspects of an industrial society, portrayed using characters from different backgrounds, but the novels would also be analyzed as the portrayal of a battle between the rational and the realist urban on one hand, and the sentimental rural on the other. The moral and spiritual decay of the British people would be narrated through a reflection on the utilitarian ideals of progress. Victorian novels would also present to us Victorian subjectivity. It is through the use of the first person in novels, letters, and travel writings that Dickens reveals a good deal, not only about his own identity, but also about the construction of Victorian subjectivity in general. His Victorian novel would reflect on various aspects of Victorian society and culture: the prisons, schools, money, poverty, fallen women, orphans, detectives, crowds, the Great Exhibition. Dickens is forever tracing the connections between these different facets of life in Victorian Britain. The manner in which he makes these connections is both unique and symptomatic, the product of an individual psychology and the basis of a cultural poetics. From the very start, a major element in Dickens' career as a writer was his recognition of the strangeness of life in the 19th century. Sketches by Boys, written by him in 1833, represents an early attempt to investigate and grasp the nature of an environment that had totally revolutionized the lives of its inhabitants within the space of a few decades. During Dickens' youth and early adulthood, increasingly large numbers of British people were gravitating towards an urban lifestyle. By 1851, when a census was taken, a clear majority lived in cities and large towns. It had taken only 1 or 2 generations for most British people to exchange the pace of existence in the smaller scale communities of rural areas for the experience of living with or in the crowd of urban spaces. The change of scale created problems of intelligibility and orientation, obstructions to a sense of belonging, difficulties in the way of what the critic Raymond William has referred to as knowability. What do you mean by knowability? You see, in smaller towns and villages of pre-industrial England, a walk down the high street would have involved encounters with other people. A walk down the high streets would have involved encounters with other people, many of whom would be familiar to the individual observer. But in the rapidly expanding centres of population in Victorian England, perhaps the vast majority of those passing in the street would be and would remain unknown. In the earlier situation, the observer would be able to match the outward appearance of many passerbys with some knowledge of their character and relations. The experience of the street would involve frequent brushes with individuals with a definite past. But in the teeming cities of the industrial era, there would be a crowd of faces without names or histories, a variety of surfaces without depth. Dickens testifies to the novelty and strangeness of this shift in social perceptions in his earliest published writings, composed in the early to mid-1830s. He remarks on the bizarre combination of anonymity with mere visual familiarity in his descriptions of waves of middle-aged men walking to work through the streets of London. These are figures who plod steadily along, apparently with no object in view but the counting house, knowing by sight almost everybody they met or overtake, for they have seen them every morning during the last 20 years, but speaking to no one. And once anonymity has become the norm, it alters the tone of relations even between those who do recognize each other. If they do happen to overtake a personal acquaintance, they just exchange a hurried salutation and keep walking on, either by his side or in front of him. As to stopping to shake hands or to take the friend's arm, they seem to think that it is not included in their salary. They have no right to do it. Dickens is clearly emphasizing here the unnaturalness of the crowd's behavior, even while he's ready to extract amusement from it. So many of Dickens' texts of the 1840s are built around a tension between two opposing forces, of advantages and disadvantages, control and helplessness. This kind of tension provides the basis of the more complicated relations of power and knowledge in his novels like Bleak House. So far, you've probably understood that a dominant motive of Dickens' writing was humanitarianism, especially his sympathy for the poor and his injunctions to the rich on the duty of Christian charity. Surprisingly, given the ongoing economic crisis, Dickens' attitude towards material greed went largely unremarked despite the fact that Our Mutual Friend, his last completed novel published in 1865, unreservedly damned the rich for their conspicuous consumption practices. His critique of the Veneerings and their circle, and by extension, the trajectory of British society in the age of capital, is all the more remarkable when we remember that Dickens was far from being a radical himself. He had embraced free trade in the mid-1840s, and although he had conflicting feelings about capitalist modernity, Dickens had little time for attempts by either working-class Chartists or paternalistic Tories to regulate industrial progress. Precisely such contradictions made Dickens so interesting. Although he experienced the commodity culture on display at the Great Exhibition as a kind of drowning, Dickens also reveled in the excess of Victorian consumerism. Dressed in high satin stock and double-breast pin, in glossy frock coat and velvet collar, in cut velvet waistcoat and glittering chain, as a young man he presented himself as a dandy on the streets of London. Great Expectation was the last of Dickens' weekly serials. The huge pressures attendant on serialization, which Dickens had been finding more and more burdensome in the course of his development as a monthly serialist, were suddenly enhanced at this fairly late stage in his career. He had been feeling the need for more time to devote to thinking about and planning his novels, and now he found himself with less. A Tale of Two Cities, the novel that immediately preceded Great Expectations, had also been a weekly serial, and Dickens had been so unsettled by the constrictions of the serialized novel. In 1858, Dickens commenced a series of public readings for his own benefit. This commercializing of an activity he had previously carried on for charitable purposes sharpened his perception of himself as an artist exposed more conspicuously than most to the gaze of the public. An enhanced sense of being at work in the shop window is testified to with considerable bravado in the short text Dr. Marigold's Prescriptions. This monologue was written in 1865, specifically for public performance. Charles Dickens' public readings, performances in which he took up his own novels before audiences composed primarily of readers, and brought the characters to life through his impersonation of them, invented a new genre of performance, one we now take for granted. But what were these performances actually like, and what do they mean to our understanding of Dickens, the man, the actor, and the writer? Available to us only through eyewitness accounts, prompt copies with their scribbled notes, and Dickens' own remarks about them, the readings are difficult to analyze, clearly the work of a performer, a man with theatrical experience and talents. The readings were, however, much more than monologues based on the novels. They were readings, presentations done from a book, and they were, by the author, an innovation both in theatrical performance and in the role of the novelist. This was all about Charles Dickens and the Victorian novel. If you'd like to know more about the Victorian novel, take a look at these lectures that I've done, because the Victorian novel will inculcate both utilitarianism as well as the Victorian life.